The barter zone on the outskirts of RIN.3 wasn't a place for people anymore. It was a place for leftovers. Buildings had collapsed into frames of bent scaffolding and scorched tarp. Wind carried dust in low spirals that scraped across broken solar panels and hollow crates like dry bones. Smoke from barrel fires curled upward without promise of warmth, only habit. No music, no shouting, just the dry cough of a dying market and the quiet shuffle of boots moving through the wreckage. Corin. Vale moved like a shadow in his space coat. Drawn close, eyes low, shoulders hunched under the weight of not just the satchel on his back, but the years he carried inside him. He didn't come to trade, not really. He was a salvage man. A ghost, someone who didn't speak unless pressed. Today, he was only here for wire bundles, dead batteries, maybe a strip of filter cloth. Just enough to make his shelter last another. Weak dot, but the bottle clinked once as he adjusted. His grip on the strap, that's what did it. From behind a bent stall half covered by mesh fencing and melted polyglass, a voice scraped through the wind. "You got liquor in that bag?" Corin paused, barely turning. A woman stood there, slouched, draped in a patchwork shawl, stitched together with cable ties and oil tags. Her hair was stringy and slicked back with grease, eyes sunken in a face carved by hunger and old smoke. One look at her and Corin knew she was already leaving this place in her mind. Maybe, he muttered. Her eyes sparked. "That's whiskey, Taran. Real stuff." She didn't ask to see it. She just knew. Scavengers could smell real spirits like blood in the water. Corin should have kept walking. Should have shrugged and lied. But he stood still, and that was enough. A soft metallic whine sounded as she flipped a switch behind her stall. A gate unlocked. Then they stepped out. 3 girls. No women, though barely. They walked barefoot, silent, through the sagging doorframe and into the sunlight like it meant nothing. Skin shades of violet and amethyst, with faint silver traces etched like vines across their collarbones and hips. Their clothing was sparse wraps, old ceremonial fabric, belts made of wiring. Uncoordinated, like they'd been dressed from a box of scraps. They looked alien, yes, but more than that. They looked out of place in this rot. Out of place because they belonged to it. "I'll trade you all 3, the woman rasped. "They're my stepdaughters." Corin blinked. "You're joking?" "Nope." She jerked her chin toward the girls. "They don't listen. Eat too much. I'm leaving. Got a seat on the tram. You give me that bottle. They're yours." His first instinct was disgust. The second was disbelief. But what killed him wasn't her offer. It was them. They didn't resist. The oldest one, Rena, stared at him head on, eyes narrow, arms folded under her chest. Her wrap hung low, exposing the curve of a hip like she didn't care who saw. The middle one, Kaith, didn't look up. Her hands clenched at her sides, thin tunic barely concealing the shape of her body beneath. The youngest, Serene, sat on her knees behind the others, head slightly tilted, watching him. No fear, no shame, just patience. "This isn't a trade," Corin said softly. The stepmother smiled, yellow teeth cracked and crooked. "Sure it is. I've made worse." He looked at the girls again, at how still they were, not flinching, not crying, just waiting. Like they'd done this before, like they'd already been passed over. "I don't want them," Corin said. "You stopped walking," the woman replied. "So maybe you do." Corin's hand hovered over the satchel. He should have walked, should have ignored her. But he was already imagining them left behind, picked off one by one. Or worse, he saw their bare feet on the broken pavement, their sharp shoulders and silent mouths. He pulled out the bottle. The woman's eyes lit up like sunrise. She snatched. It twisted off the cap, took a long, burning swig, and sighed like it was the first breath she'd taken in weeks. "Fair trade," she muttered, turning away. "Good luck with him." She disappeared through the flaps and smoke. No backward glance, no instructions. Just gone. The silence after her departure was suffocating. Corin turned. The girls hadn't moved. He exhaled slowly, throat dry. "You didn't ask to be left." Cyrene stood first, pulling her wrap tighter with one hand. "We have nowhere to go." He nodded once. "Follow me." He didn't look back, but he heard them. Their footsteps were soft, light, almost hesitant. And yet they followed, not because he'd bought them, but because he hadn't walked away. Asterisk, the wind had teeth that day. Sharp and thin, it scraped along the ridge like invisible razors, pulling at Corin's coat as he trudged west with 3 barefoot shadows behind him. He didn't speak. Neither did they. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. Like dust too fine to see, but too thick to ignore. His shelter appeared against the horizon, hunched and lopsided atop a rust-colored slope. A cargo container, retrofitted with salvaged stilts, reinforced with whatever Corin could scavenge cracked insulation foam, old solar foil, a collapsed transport door bent into a windbreak. From a distance, it looked like junk someone had forgotten. Which was the point. The girls didn't ask questions as they approached. They didn't look around, didn't marvel or wince. They'd seen worse. Corin stepped up the ramp, keyed in. A manual override on the door panel, and let the hatch creak open. The inside wasn't warm, but it was sheltered. A cot against one wall. A food crate. A heater cobbled from drone parts. A folding table and a curtain hiding a drainage pipe that passed for a bathroom. Everything smelled faintly of old metal and sealant. He held the door open. "Go in." Rena moved first, rushing past him like she owned the place already. She dropped her bag, if you could call the tangled wrap over her shoulder a bag, and took the cot without asking. Kaith stayed close to the wall, arms crossed, watching everything like it might vanish. Cyrene stepped inside last, slow and careful, turning once to look at him, not with gratitude, but quiet study. She didn't seem afraid, just attentive. Corin entered after them and sealed the hatch. The heater kicked in with a soft hum, struggling against the wind chill still clinging to their skin. He shrugged off his coat and set it over and overturned. "Crate." Then he crossed to the food box, pulled out 3 ration bars, and set them on the table without a word. "Not much," he said. "No promises after this." Rena grabbed one, tore it open with her teeth. "Better than starving," she said through a mouthful of compressed starch and protein dust. Kaith sat cross-legged on the floor. She unwrapped hers slowly, taking careful bites, her gaze flicking between Corin and the door. Cyrene didn't eat. She picked up the bar, held it in her hand for a moment, then set it down untouched. Corin watched her. "You okay?" She nodded. "Once. I just I'll eat later." There was no later guaranteed, but he didn't press her. Instead, he moved to the heater, sat on the floor beside it, and let his shoulder slump. The air warmed just enough to ease the stiffness in his joints. Cyrene crossed the room. She stood over him, blanket draped around her shoulders, the wrap beneath barely clinging to her thighs. "If you want me," she said quietly, "I can stay close. For warmth." Corin looked up. Her voice wasn't coy. It wasn't seductive. It sounded trained, practiced, like it was something she'd said before. "No," he replied. "You take the cot. I'll sleep here." A tiny blink. Then she nodded and sat down beside him instead, silent. Rena scoffed from across the room. Never seen a man turn that down before. Corin didn't respond. Kaith curled tighter in the corner, her arms around her knees, her tunic crumpled and slipping. She didn't move when the tears started, just kept her head buried, letting the small, choked sobs escape in silence. Corin sat upright. He didn't approach, but he didn't ignore it either. They were strangers. They weren't safe yet not, in their minds. But tonight, no one was screaming, no one was touching, no one was taking. That would have to be enough. The heater buzzed in the quiet. Pale blue light pulsed from its vents, dancing across the bare walls like distant lightning. Corin lay on his back, blanket pulled to his ribs, staring up into metal shadows. The cot creaked once. Siren had taken it after all. She lay curled, one arm hanging off the edge, ceremonial wrap still bunched around her hips. One strip of fabric had slipped, exposing the curve of her waist in the low light. Rena slept near the door, one leg propped up, arms folded. Still in her wrap, still sharp, even in sleep, Kaith hadn't moved. Her body was hidden under a storage blanket pulled from the top shelf. Her face was still buried in her arms. Corin rose quietly, crossed to the supply shelf, pulled out a flask, took a sip behind him, soft breathing. Silence that wasn't empty. Why did you take us? A voice asked. Caith. He didn't turn. I didn't, he said. She left you. A pause. So why didn't you leave too? Corin stared at the wall for a long moment, fingers tightening on the flask. Because you didn't ask to be left. Silence again. But this time it held something different. Not fear. Just uncertainty. Then Kaith lay down fully, pulled the blanket tighter. You should have, she whispered, but she didn't mean it, and Corin didn't believe it. Outside, the wind howled like a thing trying to forget its name. Inside, 4 bodies breathed in the warmth they had no matter. How temporary. No one asked what tomorrow would bring. They weren't ready for that. Not yet. Asterisk. The wind hadn't stopped. It didn't howl like it had the night before now. It hummed. A low, constant sound that pressed against the metal walls of the container shelter like a tired fist. Corin listened to it as he tightened the straps on. His satchel, checking the latches twice. He could feel the weight of 3 sets of eyes behind him, even if only one dared look straight at him. You're going out alone? Kaith's voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the stillness. She stood by the workbench, hands tucked into the sleeves of her oversized thermal shirt, one of the few things he'd managed to dig out of a buried personnel locker months ago. Corin didn't answer right away. He glanced out the side panel. Slit dust, gray sky, and the ridgeline in the distance. Depot's 5 clicks each way. I know the path. You said no one patrols that stretch, she added. He slung the satchel over his shoulder. Because no one does. Rena leaned against the hatch, arms folded. That's not what she's worried about, she muttered. What if you don't come back? The words landed harder than intended. Corin stopped moving. He looked at each of them, the 3 girls scattered through his shelter like ghosts, trying to decide if they were welcome. None of them had asked for this place, and yet none had left. Searing stepped forward, a flare marker in her hand. A small cylinder, one of the few pieces of salvage tech that still worked. Press the top, and it would emit a flashing beacon and GPS ping for 12 hours. Take it, she said, voice soft. In case. Corin hesitated, then took it from her. Their fingers touched briefly. Hers were cold. I'll be back before nightfall, he promised. Searing didn't smile, but she nodded once. Kaith turned her face away. Rena stepped aside to let him through. As he stepped out, the wind greeted him. With a low groan and a slap of grit to the cheek, he pulled his scarf tight, lowered his head, and started down the ridge path. Inside the shelter, the air turned heavier in his absence. For a while, none of them moved. Then Rena dropped onto the cot with a soft grunt, pulling her legs up beside her. We shouldn't have let him go alone. He wouldn't have stayed if we'd begged, Keith muttered. She stood by the heater, arms hugging herself. He's not like the others. That's what worries me, Rena said, closing her eyes. Sirin, still near the hatch, didn't speak. Her hand lingered over the latch, her eyes watching this empty trail long after Corin had vanished from view. Time passed slowly in the cold. Keith occupied herself with Corin's salvage. She opened one of the old filter casings, began scrubbing the rust with a cloth and a piece of brittle sponge. It wasn't about usefulness. It was about not sitting still. Rena sat at the door, watching the dust swirl outside. Sirin cleaned the sink again. No one asked her to, but the gesture soothed something in her dot. By dusk, the wind had changed. Sharper. The horizon blurred under a haze of red gold light and thick dust. Sirin stood near the door again, shifting from foot to foot. He said he'd be back. He will, Rena replied, but her voice held no certainty. Keith didn't look up. She just said, unless something changed. Those words hung in the air like frost. They all knew what that meant, what it could mean. Abandonment wasn't unfamiliar. Trust was. Sirin finally whispered, we've waited for worse men to return. Rena nodded slowly. But this one doesn't want anything from us. Keith set the filter down. That's what makes it dangerous. No, Sirin replied, voice barely audible. That's what makes it real. Then dash footsteps dot fast, heavy, close. All three girls stood up at once. The hatch creaked, then slid open with a grind of metal. Corin stumbled through, coat streaked in dust, breath ragged. His right arm cradled a bundled pack, wrapped in thermal foil. He slammed the hatch shut behind him and dropped the bundle onto the cot. They moved closer, cautious, uncertain. I found a wrecked courier drone, he gasped, wiping grit from his lips. Buried under a ridge beam, mostly intact. He unwrapped the foil dot inside, sealed ration packs, medical gel tubes, a half case of filtered water tablets, vitamin injectors still in their tubes. Clean stock, corporate issue, untouched .caith. Blinked. How'd you carry all that? Corin winced, flexed his shoulder, dislocated it halfway up the hill, reset it against a rock. Sirin reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing his forearm. He flinched at the contact then. Relaxed. Did you use the flare? She asked. He shook his head. Didn't want to worry you. Keith muttered. Too late. Rena crouched near the bundle. This'll last us weeks if we ration it. Corin slumped against the wall, eyes half-lidded. Then let's make it last. The silence that followed was intense. It was full of something that hadn't existed here before. Trust.caith sat beside him. Why are you doing this? He looked at the floor. I lived alone for 2 years, watched everyone else vanish. One neighbor collapsed outside my shelter, 3 feet from my door. I didn't open it. He looked up. I told myself it wasn't my problem. Rena crossed her arms. And now we are? No, Corin said. Now I'm making different choices. Sirin knelt beside him, placed her hand on his shoulder, not as an offer, as comfort. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not. Keith's voice came next. Quiet. Testing. Then what are we to you? Corin looked at all three of them. His voice didn't rise. People. That was enough. Rena tossed him a gel pack. Eat something, people guy. He smiled, tired and crooked. But real. That night, they didn't eat in silence. They didn't eat far apart. They sat closer, still unsure of what they were, but certain, at last, that they weren't alone. The generator failed just after dusk. It didn't scream or spark or give warning. It just stopped. A slow sputter of rising hum, then silence. The lights blinked once, twice then went out entirely. The heater gave one last breath of warmth before it too went still. Only the wind outside remained, low and constant, like a whisper against the steel bones of the shelter. Inside, the dark settled fast. Corin stood over the console, hands buried, deep in a crate of scrap wiring and corroded junction fuses, searching with blind fingers for something he already knew wasn't there. His breath was visible, steaming slightly as the cold crept in. Behind him, soft rustling. Blankets pulled tighter, tarps layered over shoulders. The sound of them moving together, not apart, told him they felt the cold too. Is it bad? Syrene's voice, hushed but steady, cut through the dark. Coil junctions gone. Generators. Still functional, but no power distribution. Heat's down. Lights are out. We've got 2 hours of residual warmth. Maybe 3 if we don't open the door. He set down the panel and exhaled, flexing his sore shoulder. The pain was back, dull and tight from yesterday's climb. We've been colder, Rena muttered from near the hatch. But even she didn't sound convinced. We had body heat then, Kate said. She was crouched by the cot, hands pressed over her arms, and no one to share it with. Silence followed that. Not because it was untrue, but because it was. Corin straightened. We'll ration what warmth we have. Syrene stood slowly, dragging one of the thicker blankets from the cot. She crossed the room and tossed it to the center. We'll need to stay close. She didn't say for what. She didn't need to. Rena didn't speak. She turned her back to the room, staring out the small port window into the dark. Her arms were rigid, her body unreadable. When she finally turned around, her face was changed, tighter, not angry, but raw, like a wound freshly exposed. We've been in worse, she said again, her voice firmer this time. But not with someone who gave a damn. Corin blinked. You think that's a weakness? She walked toward him, slow, precise. I think it's dangerous. We're not used to it. We don't know how to hold it. Then, before she could stop herself, Rena pressed forward and leaned into him fast, breath shaky. Her arms curled around his back, fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt, like she was holding on to the edge of a cliff. It wasn't passion, it wasn't want, it was need. Real, trembling, terrifying need. Corin didn't say anything. He didn't pull away. He just wrapped his arms around her and held her there, steady as the wind howled outside. Her body shook once, then stilled. When she pulled away, she didn't meet his eyes. Don't make me feel safe unless you plan to stay. He nodded once. I never planned any of this. That seemed to be enough. Rena moved to the blanket and lay down beside Kaith, who had already stretched out, half-curled, silent. Syrene approached Corin slowly, one hand brushing his. Not seeking, not pushing, just anchoring. She tilted her head. This isn't about repayment, is it? No, Corin said. It's about survival. Kaith, already under the blanket, whispered. It's about choosing what feels right. Corin looked at all 3 of them, the way they'd drawn together. Not from fear, but something quieter. Trust, he sat. The cold crept in fast, but they were faster. Rena shifted closer, her body pressed against Kaith's back. One arm draped over her sister, like it had done so many nights before, long ago, in shelters where trust couldn't be afforded. Kaith rested her head on Corin's chest, cheek against his shirt, not speaking, just breathing. Syrene lay on his other side, curled gently, her legs slipping over his, her hand resting atop his chest, without asking. No. One made a move beyond that. There was no heat left in the generator. Only in bodies. In closeness. In the kind of stillness. That said, I am not afraid tonight. At one point, Siren whispered, "Can I?" She didn't finish the question. She didn't have to. Corin reached for her hand, held it tight. Yes. Kaith's fingers brushed the line of his jaw. Her lips hovered near his throat. "You're warm," she murmured. "You smell like earth." He kissed her forehead. Rena's voice came next, low and quiet from the dark. "I don't want to be alone again. Not ever." No one answered her. They didn't have to, because in that moment in the cold, tangled heap of limbs and blankets and breath, they weren't. The shelter might have lost power, but something else had ignited. Not fire, not sex, not even love. Intimacy. Earned, chosen. Shared. And in the darkness of a dying world, it was the only light they had. And it was enough. By morning, the wind had gone quiet. It wasn't peace, just stillness. The kind of eerie hush that made every movement feel louder, every breath more noticeable. The temperature hadn't risen, but the air no longer bit at the skin. It just lingered, heavy and gray. Inside the shelter, the space felt warmer than it should have. Not because the generator had magically recovered, but because the four bodies tangled in the center of the room had remained there, wrapped in overlapping blankets and a quiet kind of trust that no one had dared name yet. Corin woke first. Elbows resting on his knees, he flexed his shoulders slowly, working out the stiffness from the night before. It ached in a dull, familiar way, like something healing with resistance. He looked down. Kaith was still asleep beside him, curled into his side, her silver-flecked eyes barely visible beneath the fall of her hair. Her arm rested across his ribs. On his other side, Siren breathed softly against his chest. Her wrap tangled around her thighs, legs folded beneath her. She hadn't moved all night. Rena lay just behind Kaith, a blanket pulled halfway over her hip, one hand draped protectively over her sister's waist. Her breathing was slower, deeper, but her expression, even in sleep, still held edges, like she was guarding them even now. Corin let himself watch them for a moment, not with hunger, not with guilt, just observation, quiet recognition of the impossible thing they had built without. Realizing it, he stood gently, careful not to wake them, and moved to the small mirror near the sink. His reflection stared back with tired, dust-marked eyes. Jaw unshaven, hair flattened to one side, shirt wrinkled and stretched from sleep. But the weight he carried in his shoulders felt different this morning. Lighter? No. Shared. Behind him. Fabric shifted. Caleb stirred first. Still wrapped in a blanket, she sat up, blinking slowly, her face unreadable at first. Then her eyes found his in the mirror. "You didn't sleep much," she said softly. Corin shook his head. "Didn't want the shoulder to lock up." She rose quietly, the blanket slipping to reveal the edge of her tunic, pulled taut against her hip. She didn't fix it. She just rubbed her hands for warmth, then looked around. "This place is quieter than I expected," she murmured. Not just the silence, the feeling. Corin turned. "Quiet's not always safe." She gave a small shrug. "We never had anywhere quiet." "Not really." He studied her voice, her posture. Something in it had changed. Softer. Not healed. Not yet, but willing to be. "Where were you before she brought you here?" he asked. Her eyes dropped. She sat near the workbench, knees pulled up. "A trade convoy," she said eventually. 3 months, maybe more. Everything was barter. Our labor, her lies, sometimes worse. Corin didn't interrupt. She told the convoy master we were. "Hers," Caleb continued. "Said she'd raised us after the war hit our district. Maybe she did. I don't remember being alone before her. But I don't remember being safe either." Her fingers trembled slightly where they gripped the edge of the bench. She didn't hide it. "We got passed between outposts." slept in loading bays, locked in rooms while she negotiated. She was waiting for someone to buy one of us. All of us eventually, but no one ever did. She looked up now, steady. Not until you. Corin's throat tightened. He sat across from her, the space between them small but meaningful. I didn't buy you. Her head tilted slightly. Then what are we doing here? The silence after that was an awkward dot. It was devastating. Corin looked her in the eye. Don't know, but I'm not putting a price on it. She nodded. Not in agreement, but in recognition. You should know, she said after a beat. I don't trust Easy. Not anymore. I don't expect you to. She studied him. A long pause. That's why I think I might. Before he could reply, the hatch clicked. Rena entered, barefoot, carrying a folded tarp and a coil of stripped wiring. She glanced between them. Morning therapy, she muttered, or just airing out trauma. Hard to tell. Kaith tightened her blanket. Just starting the day. Rena set the supplies down, knelt near the wall, and muttered. Storm cracked one of the outside coils. I'm going to reroute the wire from the fence. I'll help, Corin said, rising. No. She didn't look at him. You're still healing. A heroic solo act was yesterday. She glanced at Kaith, then back at Corin. Besides, you've got company. She stepped back outside without waiting for an answer. Corin sat down again, still processing her words. She likes you, Kaith said softly. No, she doesn't. She does, she said again, without smiling. That's why she's rude. Cyrene emerged from the cot, stretching lazily. Her wrap had slipped almost to her waist. She didn't adjust it. What smells like sweat and awkward honesty, innocent? Here, she asked with a yawn. Corin blinked. Kaith chuckled under her breath. Relax, she told him. I'm just glad everyone's talking. Cyrene crossed the room and touched Corin's shoulder gently. Still hurt? Less today. I could massage it later. We used to help each other after convoy days. Pressure points near the collar. You don't need to offer anything, Corin said softly. Cyrene's smile faded slightly. But I want to. He looked at her, not her body, but her eyes. She wasn't teasing. She was offering care the only way she'd ever been taught to give it. He nodded once. Later, they shared breakfast, if it could be called that. Rehydrated starch bread, crushed vitamin mix, and the last of the fruit gel. It wasn't much, but no one complained. They sat closer now. Shoulders touched. Fingers passed rations. Across one another's arms. No one flinched. Later, Corin joined Rena outside, helping twist the wire into a makeshift heating coil. She worked in silence until she finally muttered, You act like you don't want anything from us. I don't, she kept working. But what if we want something from you? Corin looked up. Like what? She didn't meet his eyes. A reason to stay. He didn't answer right away. He adjusted the bracket, locked the tension, then replied quietly, And I guess I'll have to give you one. And for the first time since she arrived, Rena smiled. It wasn't wide, but it was real. Asterisk, the wind returned by nightfall. Not a storm, but a steady pulse, like breath from some sleeping giant. It pressed around the container, curling into the cracks, tapping at the walls with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Inside, the shelter glowed dimly. The new heating coil buzzed in the corner, casting a faint orange light that flickered against the riveted metal walls. Kaith stirred a pot of grain on the portable stove, the steam rising slowly into the stale air. She moved with a calmness that hadn't been there a week ago. The tightness in her shoulders eased, her hands steady now as they stirred. Corin sat on a storage bin nearby, his legs stretched out in front of him, one arm wrapped loosely in a strip of cloth where Cyrene had massaged his shoulder earlier. Her touch had been careful, practiced, not sensual, but healing. Her breath had stayed, even the whole time, her hands respectful, knowing where to press and when to stop. She sat next to him now, legs folded under her, head resting lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move her away. There was nothing transactional in the way. She leaned against him. No tension. Just weight, contact, something human across the room. Rena sat with her back against the wall, a salvaged utility blade in hand. She scraped at an old piece of plastic plating, cleaning the edge. Her long burgundy wrap had loosened around her hips, exposing a leg dusted in scratches and faded bruises. She didn't hide any of it. When her eyes wandered, they found Corin. And Searing watched, measured, noted, but she didn't interrupt. Kaith ladled the grain into dented metal bowls, handed them out one by one. When she passed Corin his, their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. "You added something," he said after a bite. "Asterisk crushed vitamins," she replied. "Simulates salt." Searing smiled faintly. "Luxury." Rena didn't comment. But she finished her bowl first. When the meal was done, they cleaned together. Kaith wiped the bowls with heated cloth. Searing scrubbed the prep table. Rena sealed the side vent with foil wrap without being asked. Corin tightened the latch on the front hatch, feeling a strange quiet settle into his chest. Not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. Temporary, fragile peace. But real. As the lamp dimmed and the wind ticked softly outside, the girls began to drift toward their sleeping spots. But they didn't spread out tonight. Kaith pulled her blanket to the center near the heater and left half of it open. Rena lay beside her this time, not across the room. Searing moved toward the cot toward Corin and didn't hesitate. She looked at him. "You sure?" He nodded once. "I am." Asterisk she settled beside him, not pressed tight, just close, intentional. Kaith rolled to face them, her blanket drawn halfway over her torso. "You're still warm," she murmured. "I'm still here," Corin said. Silence fell, long, unspoken, honest. Then movement. Kaith shifted up from her spot, crossed the room, and knelt beside him. She didn't speak for a moment. Her fingers brushed the edge of his sleeve. Then softly, "Do you ever wonder what happens after this?" Corin looked up at her. "After what?" She gestured around the shelter. "This, us. It can't be just survival forever." He watched her. Her silver-flecked eyes caught the low light again. She didn't look hopeful. She looked terrified. "I haven't thought that far," he admitted. "I used to dream," she said, "that my first night in a real home would be quiet, alone, safe. But now—" She trailed off. "It's not quiet. I hear Rena's breathing. Searing's heartbeat. I smell rust and old grain and sweat. And—" Her voice dropped. "I feel warm." She didn't say more. She leaned forward, rested her forehead against Corin's chest. Not a kiss. Just contact. The kind that said, "I exist. And I want to keep existing." He wrapped his arm around her slowly. She let him, then moved back beside the cot, curled against his side, and shared the blanket. Searing pulled it over all three of them. Rena crossed the floor without speaking, lay behind Kaith, and draped her arm across her sister's waist. No words, just warmth. Just choice. And then a knock. No, not a knock. A tap, quick, repeating, mechanical. The entire room froze. Corin sat up slowly, pushing off the blanket, motioning them back. At the door, a figure, slender, wrapped in a breath mist and traveler's coat, unarmed. He opened the hatch a sliver. "You're the one who took in the 3 alien girls?" The stranger asked. Male, calm, blunt. Corin narrowed his eyes. "Depends who's asking." The man nodded toward the interior. "You with the stepmother's wives?" Before Corin could speak, Cyrene stepped forward. "No," she said, and looked at Corin. "He's not with her." The man tilted his head. "Then who is he?" Cyrene smiled. Warm, sad and proud. "He's our husband." The man blinked, said nothing, then turned and walked away. Corin closed the hatch slowly, heartbeat echoing in his throat. He turned around. "You didn't have to say that," he said quietly. "I did," Cyrene replied. Kaith took his hand again. Rena leaned her head back against the wall, eyes half-lidded. "You're not property," he said. "Not mine. No," Kaith said. "We know." Rena finally spoke, voice softer than ever before. "But we're still here." He looked at each of them, each scar, each breath, each choice. They stayed, he would think later, lying in. The cot surrounded by 3 warm bodies and the hum of the wind outside. They weren't bought. They weren't taken. They chose me. And that night, he didn't lie on the edge of the bed. He lay at the center of something broken, of something healing, of something whole. For the first time in years, he didn't sleep afraid. He slept loved. The end.